Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Debbie Kay. I have the honor of being the League president. I hope that spring weather is raising your spirits as it is mine, and that you are feeling encouraged by the positive trends in managing the pandemic and the vaccine availability. The League of Women Voters is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about the issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors the opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and well-being. We are very pleased to announce the publication of the League's new study report. It's called Portland Police Bureau, Oversight and Accountability. Our program tonight is based on a year-long study by League volunteers. Research included document review, as well as interviews with stakeholders such as police leadership, city council members, state legislators, and police accountability advocates. You can find the study on our website, lwvpdx.org, as well as a detailed appendix with additional supporting information. When the League studies an issue, we study it big. For over 30 years, the League of Women Voters of Portland has been deeply involved in advocacy and work with the community related to policing in Oregon, and in Portland particularly. This study was approved by our membership in May of 2020, and shortly thereafter, Mr. George Floyd was killed by police officers in Minneapolis. Then throughout the summer of protests and global pandemic, the study group worked diligently to conduct interviews and review countless documents to compile the study. This report recognizes that robust accountability and oversight cannot be achieved with one solution, and that good intentions are not enough. How the Portland Police Bureau functions within the community is a result of factors as diverse as policymaking, union contract terms, police training, and the role of community members. Additional factors include use of force, arbitration, racial bias, and police culture. We've invited 3 distinguished speakers who will discuss the relevant issues addressed in our study. One of those, Representative Janelle Bynum, was called to a floor meeting and will join us a little later. The League is grateful for support from the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation and the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund, and from our media partner, Metro East Community Media. They record our civic education panels as well as voter education presentations and rebroadcast them on community access channels. Please tell your friends and family to watch this program when it's available through our website, lwvpdx.org, on or after April 15th. We thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. The moderator for tonight's program is our esteemed colleague and League member, James Offsink. Congratulations to James and the study chair, Barbara Ross, for an excellent report on accountability in the Portland Police Bureau. James, I'm turning the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. We are looking forward to hearing from our panelists on their thoughts about policing, the present and future of the oversight system, the barriers to effectiveness, legislative initiatives, and opportunities for improvements. Each of our speakers will start with 15 minutes for prepared remarks, and then we'll open the forum up to your questions. So please, while the panelists are speaking, think about the questions that you would like to ask, and then after they're done speaking, I'll give you some instructions to send them to us to get in front of the panelists. Our first speaker this evening is Carol Johnson, JD and MA, an attorney who has spent her career working on civil rights. In 2019, she was appointed to the Portland Police Citizens Review Committee, which advises the Bureau's independent police review. Dr. Johnson worked with the Portland League and the links incorporated on our study. She is now the first civil rights officer for the city of Austin, Texas, where she directs the city's inaugural civil rights office. Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. And let me get my PowerPoint. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the accountability study, policing and civil rights. So um, at the height of the civil rights struggle is just a demand for fairness in policing in the criminal justice system. I can tell you that in a former life, I was a former prosecuting attorney, and I was honored to play an important role in prosecuting criminal cases. But at the same time, I was always saddened to see firsthand the disparate treatment that I would witness for vulnerable or against vulnerable communities in the criminal justice system. So I want to share just a few terms with you as we talk about policing tonight and its intersection with criminal justice, with the criminal justice system. And these terms are gonna come up as we kind of discuss the report a little bit in my section on the report that I'll be talking about. Unlawful force, the result of police officers abusing their positions of authority. These illegal actions often result in civil rights violations such as improper arrest, false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, and as we have seen, even death. Police brutality, when occurs when officers use or threaten to use unnecessary force when questioning, investigating, arresting, or even transporting a suspect. And off-duty officers who abuse their oath to serve also commit this offense, and it can occur anytime during a person's interaction with police. And then police misconduct, while variable, includes verbal abuse, psychological intimidation to allow searches, denying proper care. Civil rights violations and police misconduct occur when a person doesn't have the ability to enjoy legally guaranteed rights. And this is not a new issue. I know we've heard a lot of times that we're living in unprecedented times, but we're actually not. As you can see, well back into the March on Washington in 1963, we have been in this constant struggle to talk about, putting an end to police brutality and putting an end to unnecessary use of force. As we've seen, and as the study unfolded, and even before then, when we start talking about Black Lives Matter, I just put these slides up because these slides elicit a lot of different feelings and emotions from people when they see them. And I know that they probably mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. But I think the real issue I think that I would like to bring out is that all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. And so when we're talking about this issue of disparate impact on communities of color and disenfranchised communities, there was a quote by State Senator Lou Frederick, I believe that was also in the study, and it was just that there's just this sense that that a cop or a police officer can kill someone and never face responsibility for it. And I think that again has been the feeling, not just here in Portland, but all across the country. I took this quote from Sarah Brady Siff, who did a study for Ohio State University, but policing the police stretches back decades and is rooted in the structure of American politics itself. So our system of federalism has created a tension between rights guaranteed by the Constitution and police authority that resides at the state and local level. So sorting out those tensions remained an unfinished part of the civil rights movement. Okay, so I'm going to talk about within the body of the study, 4 areas or 5 areas rather, that were drawn, that were paid close attention to: the standard of review, transparency, representation, decision making, crowd control, and then responding to the community. So the standard of review, I think a common theme and a common feeling is that the standard of review should be changed. Currently, the standard of review for the Portland Police Bureau is a reasonable person standard. And basically, that reasonable person standard, I can't even define it for you. The courts don't even define what the reasonable person standard is. And that's the problem. Therein lies the problem with that, is that nobody really understands what it means. When you look at other jurisdictions that have been a little bit, have had some level of success, the standard of proof have been the use of a preponderance of the evidence, which is a standard that really just means it's more likely than not that that a situation occurred or something happened. The issue of changing the standard of review has come up on many occasions, but as early as a 2008 report recommended changing in the standard of review, and then later on, I think a 2010 report. So it's been a recurring theme that the standard of review, when we're looking at these types of cases and they come up, really should not be a reasonable person standard, and instead should be, we should be looking at a preponderance of the evidence. We have a couple of other areas that were brought to attention within the report. And again, if you haven't had the opportunity to read it, please read it. An extraordinary amount of effort and expertise and energy went into drafting the report, researching and drafting, and it's simply a very, very good, comprehensive report. So I applaud all of the members who worked on it, and just really, really could not recommend enough for you to look at that report. On the issue of transparency, basically, there really isn't a lot of transparency in the review process. Often the reports that come out twice a year tell little about the events themselves. The names and genders of the police officers are blacked out, the witnesses, the victims, none of that information is available, or it is available, but it's redacted. And the people and the officers are referred to anonymously. And so the public receives just little information about what really happened. And so they really don't know. They don't have a lot of information to go on and make a determination about how they feel a vote should have gone. There's also an embarrassment clause in the union contract that's used by the police bureau to help maintain that secrecy. And again, goes to the lack of transparency in the system. So that's a real issue. I think in order to be accountable, people need to be able to review information, understand what's going on, and make their own determinations. And then when you're talking about representation, so with the lack, the fact that the whole process is kind of shrouded in this secrecy, there's no public, there's no victim representation in the process. So you don't have the opportunity for victims or witnesses to come forward and tell what happened in the process. The public never has the chance to evaluate the information. So there's always just this suspicion about what really happened. And the victim and the families are not allowed to tell their side of the story. And that's a really significant deficiency, I believe, in the process. the decision-making process and the crowd control. Quite frankly, we know that the police bureau could have handled the protest better, did not really handle that well. What amount of attention was given to the decisions in the time leading up to the events that occurred? Were there different options that could have been taken that would have helped reduce tensions, avoid use of force? What are we doing to evaluate that decision-making process? And then, just training and the use of the use of tear gas and other things that probably could have been done in a better way. So that decision-making, evaluation, and crowd control. And then, lastly, looking at, responding to the community and responding to the community's needs and responding to the community's feelings on these issues. There were several suggestions that have been made. For example, providing prompt medical attention to injured persons, increasing training in the use of tools, making changes in tools such as not using lethal weapons, ballistic shields, making changes in directives covering foot pursuits, high-speed chases, boxing in suspects' cars, not pointing guns at community members, addressing communication breakdowns, ending the practice of sergeants stepping out of their supervisory role and taking part in tactical engagement, ending delays in completing investigation, imposing discipline for actions that were out of policy in the time leading up to a shooting. Following through on issues that are brought up in investigations or training analysis that could possibly identify lessons to be learned, best practices, and those sorts of things. And then, just detailed recommendations about how officers can better function in high-risk situations and following those recommendations. And so again, these issues, these 5 issues, and again, I'm just going to say, please, if you haven't had the opportunity to read the study, because I'm out of time, I have a lot more to say, but I'm out of time. If you haven't had the opportunity to read it, please do. And thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak on this topic this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We look forward to hearing more of your thoughts as we get into the question and answer in just a few minutes. Our next speaker is Sean Campbell, Chair of the Training Advisory Council, which I'm going to call TAC from now on, for the Portland Police Bureau. The TAC is a group of community members who advise the Bureau's training division and chief of police. The TAC has outlined how changes in accountability, officer wellness, public safety specialization, procedural justice, and restorative justice could improve public safety for our city. Mr. Campbell, we look forward to your remarks. Oh, you're muted, Mr. Campbell.
That would probably help a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. I don't have a PowerPoint to share tonight, so you'll just get to look at my smiling face. And I'd like to start by saying I'm very honored to be here. I feel very humbled to be in the company of both of these esteemed panel members. I feel like the least of the people here. To get started, I was asked to talk a bit about some of the progress the city and bureau have made in the last several years with reforms, as well as to kind of outline where, as the TAC, we're hoping to see the reforms move forward in the future. Kind of the heart of recent history in police reform in the city of Portland has largely been in the area of the settlement agreement, which was first negotiated in 2012 and implemented with the Department of Justice in 2014. And this was part of a long multi-year process that had some things moving forward prior to the settlement agreement actually being agreed to, other things being put in place because of it, but it was largely due to the settlement agreement that a lot of the things we've seen exist today. The settlement agreement had 5 primary areas of focus for change. One was they wished to see a shift in the training the Bureau received to more de-escalation training in both the training and directives. So basically, how do we get the police to interact with people in a way that involves less uses of force? Because it was felt at the time that the use of force was very out of hand, especially against people with mental health, experiencing mental health crises at the time that they interacted with the police. Second thing that it put it forth was scenario-based training. So instead of just having police sit down in classrooms and talk or train with weapons at a firing range, actually having simulated in real kind of simulations where they would learn and interact with different things that they weren't expecting, so they could be judged on how they reacted to different situations put to them. The third area that the settlement agreement really focused on was data tracking and analysis. A lot of the stuff that you can find about the Bureau, which they have a website called Open Data for, is a result of this, especially in the area of use of force, where you can actually look up now, every time a use of force is used by a Portland police officer, it will appear in this database with a lot of demographic information on what was happening before force being used, what type of force was used, what force was used afterward, things such as that. The fourth one that was a big change was it mandated the creation of the Behavioral Health Unit, which is a specialized unit within the police department focused on interacting with people with mental health illness issues. This includes officers specially trained to de-escalate these situations, as well as units within the Bureau that partner with mental health providers to try to do more proactive work with people who frequently interact with the police historically. And then the final part was increasing the amount of community input through the various community advisory groups. The group that I'm part of, the TAC, was created because of the settlement agreement, as well as the group PSEP, I cannot remember everything it stands for, the Portland Committee for Community Engaged Policing. So those both came out of the settlement agreement. Now, in many ways, the settlement agreement had one major success because of these things that were put forward. And that was the fact that overall, the use of force by the Portland police decreased dramatically over the last decade. In fact, it's decreased about 70% overall for the force that officers use in their day-to-day activities. I'll put the caveat right now that does not include crowd control force, which is a separate area because it doesn't happen every day under normal circumstances. That includes an 83% drop in the use of tasers, 82% drop in the use of pepper spray, and one of the largest ones, an 89% drop in the pointing of firearms at community members. I think the best example of that was about 10 years ago, you would see about 1,000 community members every year have guns pointed at them by the police. In 2019, that dropped to under 100. So we have seen some significant changes. Unfortunately, it didn't solve all of our issues. One of the biggest ones that's noticeable to the community is the number of deadly force incidents have not declined over the past decade. And this ran counter to what a lot of people thought would happen when the settlement agreement was put in place. The idea being, if you can decrease overall uses of force, then you should see a decrease in deadly force. And that has not occurred. Other areas that have caused some issues are, even though overall force has declined, the inequities we see in who receives the force has remained unchanged. African Americans in the city of Portland receive about 40% more force than the white population in the city of Portland. And that is true, that was true 10 years ago, and it's true today, so there's been no change. In the other areas of inequities, it also didn't solve any of the issues that we see with how much different communities interact with the police. Again, using the African American population as an example, throughout the last 10 years, the African American population makes up, over 22% of the police custodies in any given year, which when you start doing the math, accounts to the equivalent of about 11% of the Black population of Portland being taken into custody each year, which is a frighteningly high statistic. And the final thing that the settlement agreement didn't really handle well was crowd control events, how we track the force in those events, and how we make sure the police are held accountable for those events. The systems that were set up by the settlement agreement focused on how do we handle day-to-day uses of force. not how do we handle force in a crowd control, dynamic crowd control event. Over the past several years, the TAC has focused expressly on these inequity issues because we see it as the new great challenge that we need to take on when we talk about reforming the Portland Police Bureau and public safety in general in the city of Portland. When we talk about the inequities we see in police actions, we usually look at it with three major sources of where these inequities come from. The first one is officer bias and the biases that get created by the police directives that direct what the police do. And this is an important distinction because we have seen issues looking at some of the data where all the police might be within their directive, they're within policy with their actions, but overall those actions result in inequities for certain communities. The other area that we see as sources of bias and inequities within the public safety system are public bias. 72% of who police interact with is driven by calls for service from the public, which really decides not only who the police interact with, but where areas have more police patrols compared to others. And the final area that we have with that we see as a major driver inequities in the system is the long-term socioeconomic inequities, which are the result of broad, long-term systemic racism that has kept the African-American community lower down on the socioeconomic ladder. If you look at the numbers, the median income for the average Black household in the city of Portland is less than half of what it is for the average white household. So that is a concern. We also see some of the broader societal issues that are causing some issues, especially when we discuss increased demand for public safety services. Obviously, the big one that comes up again and again is homelessness, addiction, and mental health services available to people in those situations. The Oregonian did a very famous article last year pointing out the fact that about half of the people that are taken into custody each year by police are houseless. And this is an issue that goes beyond just the police, but the services that are available to people to make sure that they don't get put in situations where we can see these things happening. Because during that same period of time, we saw a pretty significant increase in calls for service through the 911 system, specifically about houseless people. And so because we're not solving the houseless situation, we're just putting more and more of the stuff on the police's plate, whether or not they have the training or the means to actually do anything about it. Another issue that we see, of course, is tightening city budgets. And what does that mean with how we look forward on what this public safety system should look like? So as the TAC, some of the things that we've focused on to try to help some of these issues looking forward is we have begun exploring areas such as emotional intelligence training, as well as procedural justice training. Emotional intelligence training is teaching people how to recognize how they feel in situations, to recognize how their emotions in those situations might then cause them to do certain things. Procedural justice is a lot of more targeting bias type training, where it is giving people voice and kind of stepping back and recognizing that people need to express themselves and taking in and understanding what people are trying to tell them when they are speaking. One of the goals that we have with this is not to have it be a check the box style training. We all remember, for instance, the incidents that happened at Starbucks a couple of years ago, where then they announced they had a very large corporate-wide check the box training. And realistically, nobody believes that does anything to help with issues of implicit bias or explicit bias for that matter. So we have also supported the Bureau hiring an equity analyst and an equity training specialist to research the police data to understand where inequities are occurring, and also how to put these equity trainings, not just in one or two trainings, but basically in every training the Bureau does. So there's a facet of that in everything. So it not only becomes a knowledge point, but actual cultural change over time. Other areas that we're looking into to try to help this as well. Sorry, I'm kind of going all over the map. I have a lot of things in my head here. We are also looking at alternatives to policing. The more famous one that we all know about is the Portland Street Response, which is supposed to be working with a lot of the houseless and mentally people with mental health issues to keep them from interacting with the police in the first place, and also connect them with services that can help them not have to interact with the public safety system as much in the future. Another group that we're looking at is the Public Safety Support Specialist, which is a group program that involves unarmed police, they're not police, sorry, unarmed people who work within the police bureau that are not sworn officers, so they can't carry weapons, they can't use force, and they can't arrest people, to handle a lot of lower level calls that the police currently handle. Examples of this would be if your house got broken into and you come home a couple hours later and discover this, instead of having a police officer come to take the report, a PS3 would come take the report. Or if the fire department needs a street closed because they're trying to fight a fire, you could send PS3s to close the street instead. It's a cost-effective measure where not only do you have people handling calls that don't have the ability to use force, so that's not an option, but at the same time, you save money that can then be put towards other programs that are more proactive to helping the community overall. Other areas that we're also looking at is restorative justice. Currently, the police department has when they interact with people, they have two options. They can either leave them alone, or they can take them into custody or give them a citation. The custody citation is a bit of an issue because obviously then people get a criminal record based upon that. And that can screw up your life forever after that. When you look at trying to get housing, jobs, or even an education, that criminal record keeps you from basically getting a lot of these types of services. Restorative justice is a third option where instead of having an arrest, you bring the victim of the crime and the person who committed the crime together, and together they talk it out and create a solution that is both acceptable to the victim and works for the subject, so they can provide restitution, usually through some type of volunteer service, without having a criminal record follow that person around for the rest of their life. Aside from that, other areas we think that are important looking forward are obviously police oversight. How do we have independent accountability on the police department to ensure that the community controls what the police department does? And finally, the big area that we see as well is how can we improve data transparency with the Bureau? We have a lot of data about dispatched police calls and uses of force and police stops and things like that. But what we're really missing is we really don't have an understanding of who's being taken into custody, what are they being taken into custody for, and what happens after they're taken into custody. And this is a huge blind spot in our overall understanding of what happens with the police. And furthermore, even though we have these different databases, they really don't connect to each other in any way. So it's really impossible to create a whole overall picture. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that A, the police bureau tends to not be very transparent as a giant bureaucracy, and B, the record system they use is 10, 15 years old and not set up to really do that kind of stuff easily. There's still a lot of manual entry going on in there. Anyway, I think I've probably taken up most of my time already, and sorry it's a little scattered. I'm never the best flow speaker, but again, thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions following the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Campbell. And one of the things that I was really impressed, I was fortunate to be able to be a part of the study committee. And one of the things that I really left that experience with was just an appreciation for how many passionate community member Portlanders are involved in all of the different systems that we currently have in place to try to make our city's policing better. So thank you for your work as part of the training advisory committee and all of the other pro-community perspectives that you bring to these efforts. Next up, we are honored to have Representative Janelle Bynum, and thank you so much, Representative, for cutting out. We understand that you were called into an evening legislative session, so we are extra appreciative for you being here. Representative Bynum is an Oregon State legislator who represents the 51st District, which includes East Portland and East Multnomah County. Representative Bynum serves as chair of the House Judiciary Committee and the chair of the Subcommittee on Equitable Policing. Her legislative proposals in the 2021 session included bills for a database on statewide police use of force, for prompt medical assessment for arrested persons, and limits on use of arbitration to reverse police agency findings of police misconduct. And actually, this is all I had in the prepared remarks, and several other bills. So we're very excited excited to hear from you tonight, Representative Bynum. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, James, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here. And Carol and Sean, I heard bits and pieces of your presentation. So I think we're all working on the same thing, just taking it from different angles. So I have a short presentation for you. So I'll share my screen. And I'm just super excited to be here tonight. I love sharing this information with people. And so let me move my screen down here. All righty. So as James mentioned, I am the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and this is my jam. So super excited. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about where we've been since I've been here in the last 12 to 18 months on police accountability. And just yesterday, my mother sent me a message about what Maryland had done and how they had overrode their governor's veto, and how it was just like a show of force. And then she tells me at the bottom of the message, she says, "I thought Oregon would be first." And of course, my heart is like, wow, she's really being competitive with the work that I'm doing here. But I told her, I said, "Mom, we've actually been doing quite a bit of work and we're ahead of everybody else." So, so a quick history is 6 bills in the first special session, 1 in the second, with 2 concepts in it. We didn't get a bite at the apple in the third special session. But then we brought a gang of bills in the long session, which is what we're in right now. We established, as a result of one of the bills in the first special session of 2020, the Joint Committee on Transparent Policing and Use of Force Reform. It's a mouthful. Senator Manning and I co-chaired that. And then the Speaker established the House Subcommittee on Equitable Policing, and I chaired that. Going into this work, it's not really like my personal thing, but it is. I'm a person that believes in like systems and structures and kind of order and developing outcomes based on the structures that you have. So in going into the work, I really wanted to take a look at what were the risks that we were taking. And as you know, politics, people can be very partisan. And so we could have ended up in a partisan, like log jam locking, like rams locking horns. COVID definitely has made things harder. And then some people just have a bad attitude about police accountability and police reform. And I would say publicly, people have not been taught the true history of policing in our state and in our country. So I think they're coming to this conversation with less than a full bag of library books. So guiding principles are what I always start off any task with. And ultimately, we need to focus on continuously building and earning the public trust. This is still an organization of people. And as an employer, I brought that perspective that we needed to make sure that people were not subject, meaning law enforcement officers were not subject to political whims, but they were treated as people and humans. And we also needed to make sure that if this was a profession that we valued for the long run, that we ensured that people would still be attracted to it. So that was a value. And then transparency is something that I hold near and dear. Mostly sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's hard to fix a problem if you're not really looking at it for what it is. And I didn't want to go into this work thinking that I knew everything or thinking that one side knew everything, but really employing the principle of seek first to understand and then to be understood. So here is the illustrious House Committee on Judiciary. We have Vice Chairs Noble and Power. Vice Chair Noble is a former police chief, and Vice Chair Power is an attorney. We have 5 attorneys on this committee. One person, Rep. Morgan, who was a parole and probation officer, Representative Dexter, who is an attending physician, and then Representative Lewis was a mayor and police chief. So, and I'm professionally a business owner and electrical engineer. So quite a bit of broad range of experience, but also some very focused experience in the law. So those are the names of the people. In our first special session, like I said, we've been kind of boogieing. We did a chokeholds ban. We codified the duty to intervene. So that basically was, you can't really just stand there and watch bad things happen. And what we found out was that many departments had that in their policies, but it wasn't necessarily something that the state said was a value that we wanted all of our officers to have. We also, took a bite at the apple on limiting the use of tear gas, and I would say, we attempted to intervene and have some sort of stopgap measure from the deployment of tear gas. And I'm not completely convinced that we got that right. It just seemed like police declared a riot more and more. So I'm not sure about that one, but it was progress, and it was more progress than we had seen in decades. In this second special session, we updated the use of force, which we hadn't done in 40 years. We aligned it with Supreme Court rulings and made sure that officers had to try to de-escalate the situation, that the use of force was a secondary reaction. And then we're also, and I'm not sure if they've done it completely yet, but what we also wanted to fix was the jury instructions. And so when you have a case go to trial, it's not just what the law says, but it's what the jury is told to consider. And so that is something that I think is a good feedback loop for us in trying to determine whether we got the use of force standards updated and got it right. And then Senator Manning was instrumental in banning the use of chokeholds. Third special session, we didn't get anything. That was an extremely limited session. But here we are in 2021, and we have moved quite a bit of bills. Representative Noble, Vice Chair Noble, and I agreed going in that we would have a bipartisan work effort on these. And they have all come out with bipartisan votes. We've made sure that we listen to each other, tried to understand different perspectives, and we have a slew of bills coming to the House floor very soon. So again, we are working on munitions and tear gas, another way to attempt to get at that. We approached new legislation with respect to training. So you have to deliver CPR to a person and making sure that that is a state value. We've standardized the use of force reporting, mandating that all departments report to the federal database, with the secondary step of creating our own statewide database. And it's good to know, I did take a look at what Portland have, but I think that type of reporting with additional detail should be statewide. We took bills from the Racial Justice Council and worked through that with military surplus purchases. People were saying they did not like the militarization of the police. So that was feedback. That was bipartisan. One request that we had from the police was really interesting. They were concerned about getting doxxed, and that's basically having your public information shared all over the internet. And then people come to your home or threaten your family, just threaten your personal safety in general. So from that doxing conversation, we were also getting that from people who had been in the protests, whether as an observer or a participant. So we were getting we were getting complaints really, or concerns from journalists, from observers, from people who were arrested. that mugshots were being, posted, and they were getting doxxed as well. So we've proposed the banning of the publication of mugshots until someone is actually convicted of something. We included training on bias crimes. That actually came from a constituent out in the Lincoln City area. So this was really a statewide project. Uniforms, the concept of anonymous policing was something that we rejected. And we felt that police officers should be identifiable, both if a person had a concern or complaint, as well as if they wanted to offer a compliment or commendation. We felt like both sides of those merited uniforms and identities being transparent in crowd control situations. And then another bill came from Representative Marsh, who is way down in Ashland, and she proposed trauma-informed policing. So something that Sean alluded to as well. More bills. So if you think we haven't been doing anything, we have. Of note in this one is House Bill 2930, where we've proposed a much stricter standard of arbitration, a higher level, so that officers who are in the arbitration process, that the decisions of the arbitrator wouldn't challenge the public trust as much as they've challenged us now. What we had was a situation where the most egregious cases would go to arbitration, and then the way arbitrators were picked, there was a sense of maybe customer service, and they would end up splitting the baby, which is not the best metaphor, but they would split the baby. So half the people, who really deserve to be terminated would get away with it. And then the other half wouldn't. And so we were still getting a good half of the people that shouldn't be wearing the badge anymore, still having the badge. Background checks is important. What was added to that was a statewide standard for background checks. That was not the case before, as well as access to social media. We made sure that we are not crossing the line on constitutional free speech and freedom of association, because again, that is important. But we also know that police have to be held to a higher standard, and any engagement and involvement in groups that support like white supremacy or racial supremacy of any type really aren't healthy for the community. So that, I think, 2162, we mandated that all police agencies become accredited, and that would help with training and records and making sure that there's a sophisticated management structure. We take for granted a well-run department, but when you have a poorly run department, it shows up in the newspaper, but it also affects people's morale. It affects the community, the hometown. So that was one of the things that we chose to move forward with. So to close out here, what I learned was that honor and reputation were important to public safety officers. And as we went forth with these conversations, I always needed to keep that in the back of my mind so that we could try to move together in a way that wasn't hostile. But we had a lot of solid officers that wanted change, and I needed to keep them engaged. We also had the community that wanted change. And the only way that we could make change is to listen to one another. As I mentioned before, some issues touched multiple constituencies. So like doxing, it was the press, it was the police, it was people who were observers for no other reason, like they could identify people in a crowd. It was people who were arrested. People were losing their jobs, they were losing a sense of security in their homes, their wives were getting threatened, their children, and that's not okay. And as I mentioned before, people really don't have a good idea of what the historical record is on policing and how it has really negatively affected Black and Brown communities. I'll submit the link for this presentation to the organizers so that you can look through the press links here. And what we've teed up for 2022 include, bills that we weren't able to necessarily get to this time. We have qualified immunity, which is there, resty well-being. Those concepts were things we discussed, but things that were a little bit harder for us to get to. And we took quite a bit, quite a bite at the apple. So the next steps for the policing bills in the legislature, bills that had a dollar sign next to them mean that we need funding. So we'll have to go to bat for that. And the others, we have requested that they move in one chunk out of the House committee. So we moved that on Tuesday night. Sorry, what's today? Today's Tuesday. So maybe we moved that a week ago. And that goes out to the House floor, sending it to the floor in a chunk, and then sending all of the bills over to the Senate in a chunk. So with that, I am complete.
Wow. Well, that was a tour de force of police reform and criminal justice reform in the legislature. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Representative Bynum. So we are now moving into the audience engagement portion of the event. So as I mentioned before, I hope as you're watching along that you have been coming up with questions. We've received a few so far, and if you can send those in the chat, I think it shows up as sending it to the panelists, but I will be receiving those and kind of curating. I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them because you have league members are known for your excellent questions. But we'll do as many of them as we can. So if people could please start sending those. And before we hop over to that, we do like to extend the invitation to panelists now that you all have seen each other's presentations. If there was any question that any of the panelists had for one or more of the other panelists, we want to make space for that now. It's okay if you don't. We also have a lot of questions, but I'm happy to field something if there was anything that panelists wanted to ask of each other. Going twice, and I'm going to move on to the questions that we've received from the audience then. So this question was originally addressed to Representative Bynum, but I actually think that it can be broadened, and I would like to hear if any of the other panelists also have thoughts on this, but we'll start with you, Representative Bynum. The question was about, you noted in your presentation that there were areas that you were surprised to see the police and the public in agreement on changing. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that anymore, and other folks from your perspectives, areas where this story is told, the narrative is told in the media, I think frequently as kind of a, community versus police or activists against police or something. But I think, as I imagine you all have seen, as those dialogues are opened up, there are, I think, significant areas of agreement. I wondered if any of you could flesh out observations on that.
Well, one of the things I found was that there were a lot of officers who knew that things were not perfect, right? No organization is perfect. And I think where we were falling short as a community is we didn't have enough pressure relief valves to allow people to say, hey, something is wrong without some sort of retribution, right? So that's where you have that thin blue line and that, family atmosphere. One of the things that was really helpful was engaging with NOBLE, which is it's the Black Law Enforcement Officers Organization. And they had concerns about their own safety in a department. So they knew when officers, because they would observe them, may mistreat someone based on their race. And that frightened them too, because as soon as they got out of uniform and went home, they were no different from the general public, right? So we got a lot of information and perspective from talking with different groups like NOBLE, like the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police. We also had hearings that included the tribes. And so they agreed on the background checks. Standardizing background checks was something that they were out in front about, as well as the doxing. I mentioned that. And then other people felt like it was kind of an underground thing, I would say, on the arbitration. People wanted to make sure that people who didn't deserve to wear the badge would never wear the badge. And they didn't like their names being mixed up with bad cops. So arbitration was one as well.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson or Mr. Campbell, did you want to weigh in on that as well? Don't let me pressure you into doing it.
No, I was just going to say to Representative Bynum's point, I think there are a lot of really, really good and dedicated law enforcement officers who understand, that culture needs to change. And that it's really important for them to have an environment to help, because culture has to change from the inside. It can't come from the outside. So it's going to have to be something that changes from the inside, and it's going to come from the establishment. And so I think to that point, it is important for them to have an opportunity, to have an environment, to have an atmosphere where they can speak up and speak out without fear of reprisal or retaliation or some sort of negative retribution. So I would just echo her sentiments there.
Thank you. And actually, Dr. Johnson, that is an excellent segue into, I think, what will be our next question, which is about changing the culture of the Bureau. I mean, not just the Portland Police Bureau, but police bureaus in general. And I wondered if folks had thoughts, and I'm going to throw it a little bit to you, Mr. Campbell, about, maybe one low-hanging fruit, or where you would start, one thing or two things that you would do that you think would go a long way towards changing the culture. But really, I'm interested in hearing any of your thoughts on low-hanging fruits or first steps on trying to change police culture.
Oh man, that's a big question. One of the things I think, when you look at any organization or bureaucracy the size of the Bureau, you can't force the culture to change. The more you try to push it, the more it will push back. Rather, you have to introduce things that are more like nudges throughout the system. That's where, for instance, talking about the equity training specialist and the duty they're expected to do, we see that as an important part, because instead of trying to say, okay, sit down and take this course about why you need to change, you introduce little pieces everywhere in everything they do, and over time it naturally changes. I think in that too, it's important to always remember that when you're trying to change a culture, you're trying to sell it to them in ways they understand. One of the things that we've tried to do at the TAC over the last couple of years is really make sure that every recommendation we make recognizes three things. What's the benefit to the community of this recommendation? What's the benefit to the police officers who are trusted with public safety? And how does it affect the bottom line? Because in the end, those are the three big points of resistance to get anything done. One of our big breakthroughs working with the police over the last couple of years was recognizing officer wellness as an issue, and recognizing that they needed help making sure they had the mental health services and the correct mental health services so that they didn't burn out. And so it was just showing that we understood that they had an issue that maybe wasn't really recognized by the community as much, but showing we were willing to work with them on that, where it opened up a lot of doors for discussions about things like emotional intelligence and implicit bias that weren't open before. So I think that's kind of how you start changing that culture.
Great, thank you. And definitely the officer wellness part, I think, is something that is a little bit more now in the cultural dialogue about it as well, because of course the community doesn't want police officers who are undergoing their own traumas, or underslept and overworked. All of that, of course, also has negative effects on the community. Representative Bynum or Dr. Johnson, did you want to weigh back in on what you see as maybe some places to start with? And as Mr. Campbell highlighted, of course, cultural change, I think, for a large organization takes, or an entire profession maybe takes, a long time. But what are the things that, seems important to start on now?
I'm a structures person. So I think one of the things officers told me was that they needed predictability and clarity in the rules. And things couldn't be wishy-washy because they had to make split-second decisions. And so having clear, bright lines for acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior, and then having the trust in their management that they would enforce them consistently. So one of the complaints that they had was an internal network. Some people would call it like a good old boys network, where some people were disciplined for things and other people weren't. And that really, I think, that led to our work on statewide disciplinary standards and the transparency on those. So where we ended up, where I wanted to have was like pretty much all of the disciplinary write-ups, if you will, in a database. But where we settled, and settled I use in a good term, in a good way, was that something that was everybody could understand, where there was an economic sanction that was attached to a disciplinary action that would be reported to the public. So that was their clear, bright line. That was creating some level of consistency. And it was also, I think, like a teenager, and I'm not saying that officers are like teenagers, but like a teenager, they need structure, right? They might fight it, but they definitely need to know that you care and that you'll enforce the rules, because that creates safety, both for the officer as well as the community.
Thank you so much. Dr. Johnson, did you want to weigh back in on this, or should I go to the next? Okay. So the next question, I think, is related to this one about culture change. And we have a great breadth of perspectives on the panel here. And this, I think, is maybe one of those issues that falls kind of in between the different perspectives that we have here. And it's about the police union contract and the role that union contracts play in either slowing some, police reforms or police changes, but also, of course, providing necessary, protections for public workers who are in, a dangerous field as well. And so the question was written a little bit broadly, but I wonder if folks have thoughts on specifically police union contracts, and if that is an area that, I know at least in Portland, there has been some emphasis from the community on that as a, really important place. I don't know for folks who are familiar with police accountability issues elsewhere in the state or in other states, if it's a similar focus point for communities. I guess I'm looking broadly for thoughts that panelists have on the role of police union contracts in this, moment of police reform. If there are not thoughts on it, I can, I guess, go to another question, but it does seem like an important one.
I'll bite the apple here.
All right, thank you.
I think with the police union contract, it's an area that's extremely frustrating to the vast majority of the public, because for a lot of it seems like there's these issues, especially around protections of police officers.
Can I interrupt for just a moment? They
Please
just
do.
issued a call of the House. I'm gonna run to the House floor because anybody who's in the building has to go to the floor, but I'm gonna go into a closet. And so I'll be back in a minute, but I just didn't want to disappear for
Thank
no
you,
reason.
Representative.
All right, I'll be back.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry, Sean.
This is democracy, representative democracy at work. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Kimmel.
Oh no, if running to the House floor is about the best reason to interrupt I've ever heard in my life. So. Let's see. So it's extremely frustrating because there's a lot of rules that seem archaic and out of place. And especially it makes it very difficult for the community to feel like they have control over the accountability process or any changes that happen to it. And I share those frustrations as a community member. What I do kind of try to always remember is the police union's goal is to protect its members as best as it can. And that does, as a union, that doesn't always mean they do what's best for the community. They do what's best for their union members. That's their role in this. And I do share some, and I can understand some of the fears that officers have around where if you're not a police officer, you get removed for a reason. There's a question of what do you do with your career after that? If you've been a police officer for 25 years and you are no longer a police officer, what's the job transition from there? There's not a lot of other jobs with that skill set as much as people would think. And I think that's where a lot of the people who put a lot of support in the police union, that's the kind of mindset they have. They're afraid that if the process isn't held to a certain level, that as it was mentioned earlier, then you're going to have the accountability of officers based upon the political wins, which is not fair to anybody, because there are instances where incidences have happened and the initial public reaction is different initially compared to after investigations are done. And I think that's kind of where that focus should be for them. Unfortunately, sometimes it grows beyond what it probably should actually be doing, but that's kind of what's the discussion now and what's going on in the State House at this time is discussing those things.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson? Yeah.
I mean, I would just add, I mean, just, historically, the role of every union, of all unions, is to protect against unfair labor practices, not to, hide, unethical or illegal behavior, and I think, whenever any union goes beyond that protection of unfair labor practices, then it's an infringement upon public safety.
Thank you. Representative Bynum, we were actually just wrapping up the question about the police union contract. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that. Otherwise, I can go to the next one.
I guess I would just say that it's important for community members to understand the process and what that looks like in each community. So depending on how your government is structured, your city council, your county government is structured, that process will look different depending on whether you're in Portland or Clackamas or Bend. And one of the other things that I would highlight is it's difficult to know until you start digging who actually controls the police in your neighborhood. So if you live in Clackamas, you are under the sheriff's department. But if you live in Happy Valley, you're also under the sheriff's department, but we also have our own police force that is contracted through Clackamas County. And then if you're in West Lynn, your police chief is managed by your city manager, right? So all of that matters in terms of how you get a police contract, and the mechanics of it and the structure of it will determine the outcomes for your community. So that's what I would say about union contracts.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think actually it relates to a question that we're going to take in a little bit about kind of standardization. I know that that's something that you all have worked on in the legislature this session. So the next question is somewhat directed towards Mr. Campbell about the various police-related volunteer committees at the city, including, you named a few in your presentation, the PSEP, the Portland the Community Engaged Policing Committee, I don't remember the full name, the CRC, which Dr. Johnson was also a part of previously, and then the Training Advisory Committee. And I know that there are others as well, including budget advisory committees and a bunch of other volunteer ways that folks can be involved in influencing policing, at least in the city of Portland. The question is about if there's any kind of coordination or connection between those different groups and how that works. I mean, is it kind of a greater than the sum of its parts, or is it all these groups really work on kind of mutually exclusive pieces of policing?
So right now, I think there's 11 groups altogether in the city of Portland that are either recognized by the city or the Portland Police Bureau as official advisory, community advisory groups, which is unusual. You talk to most cities, there isn't near that number of anything. Historically, these groups have been very siloed apart from each other. I don't know if I'd call it by design so much as just they got very focused on their areas and they really never had any points of contact. One of the good things that's come out of 2020 is that these barriers have started coming down and these groups are increasingly meeting with each other and sharing the issues that they see in their separate areas, whether it's very technical driven groups such as the Training Advisory Council or the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Council, or more community-based groups like the African American Advisory Council, the Muslim Advisory Council, or the Slavic Advisory Council. And having these groups come together is helping make sure that everyone actually feels like they know what's going on. Because one of the issues with these groups over time is they became very focused on their singular areas, and it became very difficult to see the big picture because of that. And so it's still changing, but the hope is eventually these groups will regularly meet with each other and with city and bureau leadership in order to make sure that that community engagement piece is there. I'll be honest, one of the hardest parts with any type of community engagement is the fact that most of us are just volunteers who do this work. And as a result, in any volunteer group, you see a lot of high turnover over time. I know with my group, you see about 1/3 of the people leave every year.
Wow.
And it's really hard for us to make sure that people are educated on some very complex issues, to make sure that we have the nuance of it, as well as make sure that we have people with the right backgrounds that can really speak to various things. If there's anything community engagement groups need, it's more support, I'd say, in order to guarantee that they can do their work effectively.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I wondered actually, Dr. Johnson, from your experience on the CRC, if you also had a perspective on this one.
I mean, I think that to Sean's point, I absolutely agree with all of that. And I think there was a lot of frustration on the CRC just because of the lack of ability to do things like, not being able to compel testimony, issue subpoenas, that sort of thing. So the power to really get at some of the information that really is needed to make decisions wasn't actually there. So I think, again, there was quite a bit of turnover on the CRC because of that frustration. And you have dedicated people who are not able to do the things that, work in the way that the CRC was actually intended to work. So.
Oh, and thanks. There's a question in here about clarifying what the CRC is, which I should have done, but since we have two experts on the line, Dr. Johnson, would you mind just reminding people which the CRC is when we're referring to that?
It's the Citizen Review Committee.
And the role of that group is to?
Look at complaints that come in against police officers and to make recommendations to council and based on their review of situations that occur between the interactions with police and citizens.
That's great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I have a few questions here. I think actually in all three of your presentations, there was some discussion of transparency, and transparency is definitely a value that the League holds dear and thinks is really important for any kind of informed community engagement. I wondered if, without wanting to repeat anything that was in the presentations, if maybe you could comment on where you think the area of greatest importance for developing more transparency in our policing system is, or, this isn't a quiz. It doesn't necessarily have to be the greatest importance, but an area that you think would be important to add more transparency, I think would be helpful. And did you catch that, Representative Bynum? Okay, great.
Well, I'll give it a shot here.
I would say in building in the infrastructure for data collection. We live in a data-rich society, and entering things manually doesn't really help us at the speed with which we need the help. So investing in those systems that allow us to mine data to make data-informed decisions, I think is probably the easiest thing, not easiest, but that's where I think we should make our investment. So sorry if I sound funny, I'm in an old phone closet, so on the floor while they.
Well, we appreciate you staying with us here at the League, even from the floor. You sound great.
I'd just like to say I fully agree with Representative Biden. If we want to solve a problem, we have to be able to understand the problem. And we can't do that without the data to actually understand it. I mean, this is something that's outside of government is pretty well utilized already in most of the private sector. And we really need to move that into the government public sector as well, so that we can not just target the police issues, but also how they relate to some of these broader societal issues, whether they're other city bureaus or state departments, or just broader kind of socioeconomic inequities.
Dr. Johnson, did you want to add to that, or? Okay. It's hard to tell.
No, I was just saying, I agree wholeheartedly with both of those, and allowing more citizen participation, access to information. I mean, if you shroud things in secrecy, then people, if there's nothing to hide, then hide nothing. And so that's just the best philosophy to operate under.
If I can add one more thing to build off Carol's statement, we added a committee this year on modernizing the legislature. And one of the topics that we discussed was really the central question of who can afford to participate. And we find that our systems are set up with, in my opinion, a sense of elitism in terms of who can afford childcare, who can afford to serve, who can afford to have to feel comfortable bringing their perspective, right? And so when we have a lot of these unpaid boards, we only generate participation from people who are either very, very, very passionate, or B, pretty well off. And so I think that investing in that infrastructure is important, and rethinking how we compensate people, even if it's just a meal like that. We have found, like with PTAs and things like that, that gets a diverse group of people out. Childcare gets a diverse group of people out. When you hold your hearings, we learned in the legislature, when I started leading, I learned that I would get public engagement when I put a time certain on my agenda, because not everybody had all day to sit and wait 2 hours to listen through my my hearing, even though I thought it was pretty cool hearing. No. So when I put a time certain on, then that generated a lot more interest, and people could be certain about when something was going to be heard, plus or minus a few minutes. So thank you for letting me add that clarification.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I, for one, will be very interested to see how the legislature and our society as a whole, especially, public bodies, but also specifically the legislature, how things return post pandemic, because I have noticed, as somebody who would sometimes go down to Salem to testify on a bill that I thought was really important, it's a much different calculus if you have to, take a half a day or a whole day off of work and figure out how to get to Salem than it is if you can, take a break from work for half an hour and click a button in Zoom. So I do hope that the legislature finds some way to not get rid of the good parts of being able to engage the entire state, but return, of course, face-to-face is a much richer way to interact. So back on the topic of the evening, the next question that I had was a little bit of a factual question, but I think that several of you might have some thoughts on it. Somebody asked if there was currently psychological assessment done when hiring and evaluating police officers. And I wondered, you know, I think there's an answer for that in Portland, but it might actually be a different answer for elsewhere in the country or elsewhere across the state.
So I only talk about things I know about, and I know that there are psychological exams administered. The complaint actually, though, has come back from, well, the feedback, how's that, has come back to say that even the psychological exam is racially biased, and we don't have enough diversity in who issues those exams. So for instance, I think one question that some of the Black officers mentioned was they asked a recruit whether they had ever TP'd a house, something like that as a teenager. And the answer was no. And they got dinged on that answer because of course everybody TPs something. Well, no, that's not really our jam. In the Black community. I mean, maybe, you know, Black teenagers do something else, but like TPing is not really our thing. And so, so they pointed out that there were some cultural barriers to people even being able to pass the psychological exam, the pre-hiring psychological exam. So that was one piece. And then I think it was Sean, you mentioned or maybe it was James, both of you, starting to look alike this time of night. The mental health needs of officers aren't being met. And we know that because the mental health needs of people, the comment there, the mental health needs of our state aren't being met. We don't have enough providers. So that we have for House Bill 2949, if you care to indulge in legislative reading late at night. But so the psych exams aren't just like a one and done type of thing. If we had that, everything would be gravy. It's not the case, but I do think it's important to engage in a healthy conversation about what mental health looks like when people are degrading in their profession, how we can interrupt that in a compassionate way. And then how we can make sure that people who really aren't psychologically fit to even enter the profession never enter it.
And Mr. Campbell, it looked like you had something to add at the beginning. It's possible the representative covered it, but was there anything else you wanted to say about that as well?
Aside from I never TP'd a house either, so no, she hit all the points. It was great.
Okay. Well, I think I'm trying to gauge time here. I do want to ask this question actually, which is directed specifically to you, Dr. Johnson, and it is about your new role in Austin. And the question is if there's a similar role that exists in the city of Portland, and is this something that would, you know, from your perspective, that you think would be helpful to add to Portland?
So that's so there's not currently a similar role in Portland. So what the city of Austin did as it was reimagining police, the Office of Civil Rights came out of that. So basically what they did was they thought about ways, okay, how can we create and improve the quality of life for Austinites? You know, we are going to reimagine our public safety, and part of that is, you know, is civil rights, you know, having, access to all of these things, and, you know, shelter and, employment and education and all these access opportunities. And so the Office of Civil Rights was kind of a reimagined part of that. And so they redirected some of the funding to create this office. And it was really, I think, you know, just a really comprehensive way to take another look at how we can create a total type of public safety for the city. So, I mean, it's actually an awesome concept, a wonderful idea. I'm really excited about it, and hope that we see these sorts of offices pop up in every city, at least every other major city in the country, because I think they're very, very necessary, and very important. And we're looking forward to building something wonderful in the city. So
that's really great to hear and exciting. And I'm sure with your ties in the Portland community, I hope that we can reach out and continue to learn as you grow into that role there, and bring back what you learn to improve Portland as well. So as the very last question, we're going to close now, and we are time limited. And I'm saying that not to be mean, but to make sure. I want you to really kind of focus the words that you say and limit it to whatever, paragraph, 2 paragraphs. But it is a big question, an important one. In Dr. Johnson's presentation, actually, that was not the part that I wanted to ask. There was some mention of that in some ways we have not really finished the work of the civil rights movement. And I think it related to disparate policing across many different communities, but especially for Black Americans. I wondered a little bit from each of you what you think it would mean to finish the movement. And I guess this is a question a little bit about kind of the future of policing or community policing. I mean, maybe it's not community policing. That is one phrase that has been thrown around a lot as a potential, solution to what kind of the role of police should look like. And we have talked a little bit about having alternate first responders and different folks. And I wondered if in just, a few sentences, when you think of kind of the role of the, police officer of 2050 in Portland, let's say, what do you see as kind of the 2 or 3 things that are going to jump out at you as to how that person would be different or the same as today's police officers? I like to save the meatiest question for when there's no, I'm just kidding. I'm not trying to trick you here, but I do, thoughts, even if they're, just a few words about what you think some of those real, next steps or the things that are going to differentiate when we've reached our end goal from where we are today.
I guess I'll start. So unless Representative, you'd like to start.
Go ahead.
Darn it. I guess when I think about what I would like to see policing in the future, I mean, we've talked a lot about greater accountability towards the community, alternatives to policing, alternatives to the current legal system through restorative justice. Well, one of the things that really strikes me that as we tackle these police issues that we need to start focusing on more beyond that are the issues behind them that result in certain groups interacting with the police more in the first place. And one of the things going through all the use of force data and everything else with a lot of the analysis I've done over the years with this is the noticing of even if we had the most accountable and perfect police force, certain communities would still have a much higher percentage of interactions with the police because of all these underlying issues of inequities in the social justice system, inequities in the economics, who has access to services, who has access to ways to better, overcome these issues. And I think until we really get down to targeting that, we're never going to see the society that we really want to see, where everyone has the ability to be the best that they can be without any bias holding them back.
That's great. Thank you so much. Representative?
A lot of times in our legislation, they use the terms police officers, or maybe they don't. We actually say it. We say police officers, but in our written text, it comes out as peace officers. And that is technically what we are deputizing as peace officers. And I believe in policing of the future, that should be the default designation, is a peace officer. And the work that I try to put forth is under the
under this idea that for me and the African American community, Black community, Brown communities, is that we are really seeking peace in our communities. Black peace, Black joy. That is what I hope that peace officers can uphold for us just as much as they do for our white community members, is peace.
Wow, what a great closing thought. Thank you. Dr. Johnson, did you want to say a
I don't
final
think
word?
I can add to that.
It was pretty good.
Yeah, I won't. I think I'll leave it right there because that embodies what I think as well.
Thank you. Well, that was so powerful. Thank you so much to our panelists. It has been a complete honor to be able to share this evening with you. And I'm now going to pass it back to Debbie Kay, who I hope will not disinvite me from the future for running a little bit over.
Never, James, never. Thank you very much to our speakers for a stimulating and informative discussion. We so appreciate your time and perspectives and values, your efforts to improve policing in our city and state, and for amplifying the critical issues from the League study. Our community has much work to do. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We would be happy to welcome you to join with us. We would also value your financial support in presenting these and other relevant programs. Please see our membership and donor information at lwvpdx.org. And though we are short on time, I need to remind you that we will have a special district election in May, next month. This includes school boards and many district races. And though not all candidates have chosen to use our excellent online resource, vote411.org, you can find information on some of those candidates and races in that website. The League will present a Portland School Board Candidate Forum on April 28th, and you can look for that on our website as a YouTube presentation around May 1st. And in addition, we will provide video voters guide interviews with candidates running for many positions in Multnomah County. These will also be available for viewing through our website before the end of April. Oregon is a proud vote by mail state. Ballots will be mailed starting April 28th, and they're due at the elections office by 8 p.m. on Tuesday, May 18th. Please plan ahead to mail yours in time or deposit it in a drop box. This is Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. This is our last civic education panel until September. We look forward to seeing you then, and I really hope we'll be able to do it in person again. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you very much.